Okay, welcome everybody to the second part of, we already started, remember, on our last Zoom meeting with the ancient Greek art. So we'll conclude that today. But first, a couple of points about your papers. So let me go ahead and do the speaker view. Okay, so I have a helpful graphic, hand printed, instructions, if you want to call it that, or sample. There we go. Sample of what your tagline, I guess, or title, whichever word you prefer, for your PDF file should look when you submit it. Hang on, let me call in. Hi, we're just starting, and we're going to talk for just the first couple of minutes or so about properly how to make sure you all are able to submit your papers properly, because if you do it in a way that is different, it could cause confusion, or otherwise your paper might go astray or not get graded at the same time as all the other ones with your paper. I mean, that were turned in on time. So, okay, here we go. This is, for all my classes that submit papers by email. And that's, you see how I did, of course, it applies to either your first or second short paper. So obviously for this class, you see how I've already modified it for Art 2.1, no spaces, right? Short paper, capital S, capital P, number 1. Obviously it's not number 2, it's number 1. I did send initially I already emailed you guys, everybody actually, about all my classes. Somehow got the second cover sheet sent. So the solution is, if you had time, and if you didn't, don't worry, as long as you label them like this, it'll be fine. But if the cover sheet said paper number 2, it should say number 1. I'll make that change if you didn't. But the point is, if you have time before you submit them, make sure you check that you submit it this way. PDF only, please, no other format. That's the college rule. So it's, again, Art 2.1, short paper number 1, underline, last name, comma, first name, and then send it to markw@aol.com. Now, if you send it to Outlook, I will get it, and it certainly is acceptable because that's the campus website, but it's so much more cumbersome to navigate that website. Just one example, I got an invitation to join the class of Berlin High School in Germany. I never went to school anywhere in Germany. I got like 4 notices. So there's a lot of spam on that website, more than there is on mine. And it's much harder to delete it. It takes 3 steps instead of 1. So please try to submit it to markw@aol. Let's see, is there someone here who just joined us? No. All right. And then I also wanted to make sure you have until midnight, and it won't be late to get it by midnight. Let's let Quinn in. Yeah, we're just starting. I just held up, so I meant to do it again, but you can see at the start of this. Well, I will do it one more time because I think we have 2 people join us late. This is the format of how your label should look when you submit as a PDF. If I said JPEG, I should kick myself. I think I said PDF, right? It's a PDF is required by the college. So it's a PDF, please, everybody, PDF only. So here we go, one more time, and label it like this, exactly. Art 2.1, short paper number 1, obviously. This qualifies for the instructions in both, of course, first and second paper. So obviously this should be labeled. If you don't label paper number 1, or you send it in a little late, which is acceptable, you only have 5 points off if it's after midnight tonight, as long as they get it before the next Wednesday. If you choose to take more time, but it has to be labeled correctly if you want me to enter it and have it graded on time with all the others that were submitted on time. Okay, so paper number 1, underline, last name, comma, first name, and then you send it to markw@aol. I've mentioned that a couple times. If you send it to Outlook, I will get it, of course. It'll just take longer to log it in. So hopefully you can take the step of sending it to the more efficient source. That's pretty much it, except that the cover sheet, I know some people can't attach the cover sheet electronically, is that the word, digitally, in the same file, same PDF file. So at this point, do your best to try and combine it into one file. It's just much easier for me and the readers to grade everything with the cover sheet right there. But if you have to send them separately, that's acceptable too. But then you need to label that that is the cover sheet for Art 2.1, paper number 1 with your last name. And then those get logged in on time, and obviously therefore no points off for being late, and the grading on them is done more rapidly and returned to you more quickly if you submit them on time correctly. Okay, so that's why I'm emphasizing all this small details. Okay, so let's see, Elijah, hang on, there we go. Okay, Elijah, I already covered this, so if you want to, you can go back and see when I post this, and I've been able to do that now since the last couple of weeks, and for the rest of the semester, every week by Friday, 8 p.m., sorry, on Friday of that week, you'll see that week's lectures posted on YouTube, usually before 8 p.m. Like I think it on Thursday night this last week. So the point is that if you submit it the wrong way, in other words, without properly labeling it or not as a PDF, it'll get set aside in a different file, and it may not get graded with the rest, and you might not get it back, your grade back as soon. Any questions? Because you guys, some of you, I notice I've gotten about 4 or 5 papers, which is a reasonable percentage since you all have until midnight. Before, after midnight, it would be counted 5 points off for being after the deadline. But that gives you plenty of time to double check. I replied to every paper I got by last night, not today, because it's a deadline. But well, I don't know what time it was. It wasn't 11. Probably 8 or 9 in the evening is the last time I checked my email. If people ask me to read their paper in advance of the deadline, they should stipulate that when they send me the paper ahead of the deadline. Otherwise, I just figure you're submitting your paper early and you don't need any feedback. And I will respond within 24 hours if you ask me to. Yes, Google Docs. Oh, thank you. That's very helpful. I have to admit, no one's ever mentioned that before. At this point, I think I've covered everything relating to the requirements for the papers. I've already read those that were submitted early enough, like 48 hours before the deadline, and given some feedback. And so far, so good. I'm encouraged. It looks like people are following those 5 requirements, and they're covering all 9 of the elements of composition. Next semester, heads up, word to the wise, we are being required to add to that list about double, 15 to 18, somewhere in there, depending on which class and which art history class you might be taking in fall of this year, because there's a new, some committee got together and decided, I wasn't consulted, but whatever, it is what it is, that we need to up the ante and make it more complex, we'll just say it that way. I don't want to say complicated, but anyway, for students when they're writing their papers to cover more elements, for instance, the golden triangle thing. I think a couple of you mentioned that in class, or maybe it's only my in-person class on Wednesday night here in the, at Santa Rosa campus, where a couple of students have mentioned that. It's not something that's unimportant, but you don't need to know that to analyze art the way that Sarah Gill's book does and many other critics do. But next semester, you will need to know that technique, among half a dozen other ones that I don't cover now. I covered the 9 basic elements that all art history textbooks, pretty much in all art critics, have always used. Sarah Gill's book, of course, is based on decades of research. She didn't come up with those ideas on her own. But we have to increase that. So your papers might be longer, almost certainly, if you're writing a research paper for a class, not just mine by any means, any art history class at this JC on either campus, whether it's in person or online. Probably your papers will have to be at least 50% longer to cover the additional elements. Just giving you a little heads up. I mean, the individual requirements about tests and things are still being worked out, but I still intend to basically use the same format for my exams. And I don't think that they're either too easy or too hard, and the length of them is acceptable. So I think I can keep those requirements the same. Just we're getting this instruction just in the last 10 days from the committee of people in the art department who came up with these new guidelines, they're called. So they'll take effect next fall. And if you have any other questions, and me or any other art history instructor, we would be able to answer them by, let's say, August, as to exactly what the requirement for each class is in terms of the grading. Okay, any questions before we start with the first must-know slide about your papers or extra credit? Of course, most of you are busy with the papers or have been or are now doing that to turn them in on time. But not too many people have done extra credit. Let me just take a glance. I'm not going to mention any names. There are a couple people who've already got 20 points. Actually, there's only one person in this class who's got that many points and one person with 5, I think. So there's plenty of opportunity, as you know, between now and final exams week to do up to 60 points extra credit, which is a large chunk of a total of 400 points. That's more than one letter grades increase that you would be getting if indeed you have perhaps less than an A when you get towards the end of the semester. You should consider extra credit, but doing it all at once is not as easy as parceling it out over the semester. So any questions you have about extra credit, you can ask at any point, of course, at the end of today's lecture or by email. All right, one more time. Any questions about the papers? I expect to see hopefully almost everyone's papers by midnight tonight. That hasn't already been submitted. Okay, let's get started with our first must-know slide. Okay, so we're on ancient Greek art. And let's get this out of the way and get this full screen. Okay, everybody can see this, right? All right, this is the first must know from the syllabus. Okay, and it's Kouros, just one word, K-O-U-R-O-S, Kouros is how it's pronounced. Athens, the location. 525 BC or BCE. Okay, so it's, you see it's a definition on your list of definitions. We have 4 of these today, so there's more than usual because ancient Greek art is still influential. We call it classical art if it's after about 500 BC. So this is on the cusp. I'll explain it when we talk about the meaning. But first, the definition of Kouros. What is a Kouros? Okay, here we go. I'll say it slowly and repeat it once. Kouros is a life-size figure of an adult male from ancient Greece. I'll say it again. It's a long definition, sorry. It's a life-size figure of an adult male from ancient Greece, comma, often depicting a military or athletic victor. You know, like all those people that got gold medals at the Olympics. Often depicting a military or athletic victor, comma, sorry, one more phrase. And sometimes, I would underline that word sometimes, not always, but sometimes used to mark their grave after they died. It's not a grave marker. Everybody follow that? I mean, it could be used decades later, assuming the person lives a normal lifetime. And back in the ancient world, most people made it to around 60 or so. So these are almost all young men, like this guy. He's clearly not near the end of his life. He's a young adult in good health. I'll repeat that definition one more time. Kouros was a life-size statue of an adult male in ancient Greece, or from ancient Greece, comma, usually depicting a military or athletic victor, right? Sorry, comma, one more. And sometimes used to mark their graves after they died. Okay, so that's what this is. It's a 6-foot-tall sculpture of someone who we don't know who it was, though, because there's no inscription or anything. So someone who won a victory in an athletic contest or military battle or something, military contest. And it may or may not have been put over the grave of that person when they died. If it had been, we'd probably have more information about who it was. So it probably wasn't, but we don't know that. It's the original piece ended here, in case it's not obvious. That's the museum space. So where it stood, we don't know. It was found in pieces underground and restored now in a museum in Athens. But there's a lot more to the meaning than that. This is not a classical sculpture. You might think it is because it's an accurate, anatomically, right? Accurate image of a human adult male. So in terms of the muscles and the body itself, yeah, that's very realistic, but not the pose is really the most important part of the meaning, that this period is called archaic. That's Archic. Some of you heard that word, usually used as an insult or pejorative. How archaic, right? Well, in ancient art, it means the early, less skilled period of a given culture's art. So, because we don't say primitive, this isn't primitive. It's more skilled than that. I'll say it again, archaic, right? Archaic. This is an archaic style sculpture. Meaning what? Well, this is the main part of the meaning. First of all, the pose is stiff, formal, and unlifelike. Stiff, formal poses and unlifelike. I should say stiff, formal, and unlifelike poses. Nobody stands like this normally. I mean, maybe if they're in a military camp or training or something. It's not a normal human pose. So I'll say it again. Two things that mark something as archaic style in Greek art is the stiff, formal, unlifelike pose. The other thing is really the most obvious. Look at his face. That's called the archaic smile. It's a frozen, the other word some people use is a frozen a smile or expression. This isn't a portrait of an individual. They could have substituted the heads in many of these workshops. You know, these things were made in workshops. They were mass produced, of course, they had to be. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people every year in a city the size of Athens. You know, it's at least 300,000 people, we think, back then. Would have needed these sculptures to honor one of their, like a parents would do it for a son, right? Or an uncle, whatever. So people would order these sculptures to honor a victory in one of their young male family members. If you're curious how these got to be created. And so they were mass produced and the faces were interchangeable. There's no individualism. There's no unique features here. It's the same expression on all these archaic sculptures, these are Kouroses, which is the frozen, I call it frozen, you can call it archaic or frozen smile, which doesn't have any realistic emotion at all. It's like, the person's literally just, staring out into space with no thoughts or feelings. Even look at the eyes. The eyes aren't even lifelike. They're not meant to be. The sculptures in this period, before classical now, we call that's the period up until about 500 BC, were not as realistic in terms of the pose or lifelike in terms of their expression. In fact, they're almost lifeless expressions. So that's the whole meaning of this. That's what a Kouros is usually. In an earlier version, it's not going to show any emotion or any other kind of realistic detail on the face, and the body is going to be a stiff pose like this. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. It's balanced. Well, of course, it's an intact human body, totally, right? Balanced left to right, and of course, depending on where you draw the line, top to bottom. Again, like all intact human bodies, it's going to have rhythm: 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 eyes, and of course the muscles and the hair. By the way, you see that he's got dreads. That's not obvious here. And then the simulated texture and real texture are equal, like all sculpture, pretty much. Certainly human figures carved out of stone, you see that it's smooth. By the way, it's marble, smooth, real texture of marble. And then the simulated texture of the hair and the muscles, and of course the fingernails and toenails. That's done with carved line, of course, is the only kind of line. Now, this is a cool off-white color. It's discolored over the centuries from being underground, for thousands of years, from the chemicals in the earth. But the original stone was cool gray or off-white grayish color. It's not warm. It was never warm. And then we have stable. Well, the whole thing by definition is stable, except the top of his head, because he's standing in this stiff upright position. Obviously, there's a couple dynamic details around the face, but it's almost entirely stable. It's a single mass. There really is no other technique. And for space, it's a 3-dimensional object. It's 6 feet tall. I don't think you could say the hair overlaps the forehead. I guess you could make that case. And then it has, of course, no modeling. It's just the lighting from the museum. Okay, now the next one is not a must-know, but I just want you to see this same concept with a female figure. You don't have to write this because I used to make this a must-know, but I took it off the list. This is a female version of a Kouros, And this one was about 4'10". That was not an uncommon height for women in the ancient world, not just Greece, but all over the ancient Mediterranean. And here she's got that 1,000-yard stare. I call it the Prozac just kicked in look, where she's looking at us as though, you know, something's going on behind her eyes there that isn't a normal expression, of course. And all these female versions, they were called Kore. You don't have to know this, it's not on the test. Kore, female version of the chorus. All of them had the same kind of 1,000-yard stare, or again, they called them archaic smiles or frozen smiles. But here there's color. So we know many Greek sculptures did have color originally. You even see bits of her dress, the pattern of her dress that's left on the marble. And yes, she's missing part of one arm. This is from the Louvre in Paris. I saw this piece. Actually, I think I got this on the internet, but yeah, I remember seeing a whole room full of these. So there's a female version of it, of course, but you don't have to write about that. It won't be on the exam. But this is a very important slide. So hopefully all of you are going to take good notes because it has a high probability, I'll say, of being on the midterm. And it has to do with a brand new technique that the ancient classical Greek sculptors invented. So here we go. The title is Spear, 2 words, Spearbearer, just like it sounds, Spearbearer. Polykleitos, the artist. See, we know now, we're starting to know the names of some of these artists. Polykleitos is Polykleitos, Polykleitos, 450 BC or BCE. This is a classical sculpture. Classical, of course, is ancient Greek. We're talking about ancient Greek classical era or classical style sculpture. This is done in the golden age of ancient Greek art. Mostly it's obvious in their new technique. That's what this is an example of more lifelike poses and emotions on the faces of their sculptures. So their poses are more lifelike and their faces have some realistic emotion. So what's the next term? Now, this is a really important definition. I guarantee this definition will come up in maybe two possible different parts of the midterm. We will review what's going to be on the midterm and cut the list down, right, of slides from by 40% or so, and also on the definitions, but not this definition. It's definitely going to appear on the midterm. Contrapposto, now it's spelled for you, but you know it's on your list of terms, right? And that's with 2 P's, one word, contrapposto, contrapposto. What does that mean? Okay, again, I'll say it slowly and repeat it once. It's a pose for ancient Greek sculpture, which had 3, it's a pose for ancient classical, I apologize. It's really important to distinguish this. It's not archaic. They didn't do this in the previous centuries. I'll say it again. The first part is, it's a pose for ancient Greek classical sculptures, comma, in which the figures had 3 features. Sorry, not a short definition. 3 features. Let's see them one by one. First, one arm is down, right? And the other is raised, usually holding something. Well, he was holding a spear, but that was missing when they found this piece, you know, buried for thousands of years. So they just put a piece of metal, but he would have been carrying a full spear. So again, the first feature of a contrapposto pose is one arm is down and the other is raised, usually holding something. The most important part is that the weight is on the back leg. That's an important distinction. I remember having an interesting discussion with some of the students last semester, and they had some valid questions about that. But look carefully. You see where the knee is here and this whole part of his leg? That leg is in front of this leg, even if it's only by a few inches. So one more time, the second feature is that the weight is on the back leg. It's not about right or left. It could be either leg. So I'll say it again. Number 2 feature is of contrapposto. The weight is on the back leg and the front leg is loose. You see, he's even not putting weight on it at all. He's raised his foot. I'm barely touching the base. So that's the most obvious difference between this style and the early archaic stiff, unlifelike poses. Okay, so what's the third feature? The spine forms a gentle S curve. The spine, what we'd be talking about from here up, forms a gentle S curve. Okay, those are the absolutely all visible features, all easily recognized once you know what they are for this pose. It was, some think it was invented by Polykleitos. We have no proof of that, but just say he's the first. It's part of the meaning now of this. Polykleitos was the first famous classical Greek sculptor, sorry, as in the person. Again, the first famous classical Greek sculptor to use the contrapposto pose. He may, or some historians think he may have invented that pose, but there's no way to prove that. Okay, so does anybody need me to repeat that definition of contrapposto? Because it's definitely an important one for the midterm. Okay, one more thing about it on the meaning is probably obvious to already many of you. These white lines are repairs, patches, or whatever you want to call them. This piece was found in sections. I mean, this sculpture, sorry, was found in pieces in the ground, and it had to be restored. So these are pieces. The white lines here are concrete, literally holding it together so that it was reassembled as a single sculpture, single figure. Okay, and then the last fact about the meaning is that this is a Roman copy of an earlier Greek sculpture. The original piece by Polykleitos, I don't think it's ever been found. I've never read that it has it. So he invented this, not invented this pose, he used it before almost anyone else in ancient classical Greek sculpture studios, but he was the most successful. In his lifetime, you could add that one last fact actually, is that Polykleitos was the most successful of all the early classical Greek sculptors. And that's why some people just did give him credit for inventing the pose. But again, we don't know that for sure. But this is a Roman copy of the original. The Greeks and Romans both used this style of contrapposto poses as soon as they were invented, around 500 BC or so. We say the 5th century, the 400s BC. All right, that's plenty on the meaning. Formal analysis. Some people look at this and they say it's warm on the bottom half and cool above. Well, you know, as it looks now, it is. So I wouldn't count that wrong if you said that, if this is on the short essay part of the midterm. But originally, it was entirely cool. That kind of light gray color of marble. It was cool. There wasn't any warm colors originally. And then we have the fact that it's got simulated texture, superb, including on the face where there is a motion, right? You can see he's getting ready for some kind of contest. He's probably in an athletic contest, like, you know, maybe an Olympic game or a local version, some kind of spear throwing contest or something. So he's waiting to join whatever it is or to perform in some contest. So at this point, we can say that the simulated texture is superbly done on the face, the hair, the muscles, but it also has the real, of course, smooth texture of marble, both. Then we have, let's see, the balance, totally balanced, as all intact human bodies would be, top to bottom and left to right. But is it stable or dynamic? This pose, by definition, is slightly more dynamic because of that S curve. But he's still at least as much stable as he is dynamic, because his arm, even this arm raised, is more almost in a, you know, straight line, and certainly the one that's down. And both legs are mostly straight up, at least to the point where the one that's loose and the knee from below the knee. So it's a mixture. Now his head obviously is dynamic, so it's both. Here there are separate masses. First his body, then the tree stump, and then it would have been the spear, even though now the spear is missing, and this is just a modern replacement. But originally would have been the third largest mass. Again, for space, it's real space. There is a little bit of overlapping. No, you could say his hand overlapped the spear, and one leg overlaps the tree trunk. The modeling is just a Shadows Museum. Symmetry texture, I think I said about line, it should be obvious with sculpture. It's almost always carved only. Carved line is used. And let's see, mass, I already covered that. I think we got the rhythm. Yeah, obviously it's repeated. I did say that about the eyes, the hands, the arms and legs. So, sorry, this is one last fact about the meaning I should have added earlier. So you can now, before we move on to the next lesson, you should add this in the margin, however, is easiest for you to do, about meaning. His physique is perfect. It would have been considered perfect, at least by the ancient Greeks. And that has a symbolic meaning. The Greeks believed that someone with a perfect physique was favored by the gods. And so it's almost a religious statement. In fact, it is that if you are looking at a sculpture of someone, or you're creating one as a sculptor, someone with this kind of perfect physique, then you're in essence showing the world that that person is favored by the gods. They believe that's how they're, gods, plural, of course, they believe in multiple gods, dealt with human beings. They granted some people, better features, better life, more strength, whatever, better, life. And therefore they were being favored. And the gods played favorites. Of course, if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that's true all the way through their entire history. They believe some humans were just, being given special treatment by the gods. So that would be symbolic. Whoa, whoa. Sorry, it's doing this thing here. I don't know why it's not showing the arrow there. All right, so we finished the formal analysis. Any questions on that one? Because that's very important. And then so is this. It's our next must know. And it also has a high, I'll just say a likelihood of being on the midterm. This is the next must know. Parthenon, one word. That's Parthenon, Parthenon. And the two architects, we know who they are. So but you, of course, it's an open book, open note test. So you have the spelling right in front of you, but you want to get it right in your notes. For today, Callicrates and Iktinos, two architects. They were a two-man partnership, or you could just say partnership, architectural designers in ancient Greece. Kallikkrates, Callicrates, and Iktinos is Iktinos. 432 BC or BCE. By the way, I've said this before, but I'll mention again when we do the review for the exam, and when the exam itself is on the slides are on the screen at the start of it, I will remind you, you can round any date to a 0 if it isn't already that way. But of course, with the open note thing, it's probably not even an issue. But if you wanted to, you could write this, if it's on the exam, as 430 or 430 apostrophe S if you chose. But I want to give you the exact date, which the textbooks usually do. Okay, so what are we looking at? We're looking at the main temple in Athens dedicated to the goddess Athena. And if you don't already know, you definitely want to write, who was she? Well, she was very powerful. She was the most important goddess. You don't have to say female god, obviously, the most important Greek goddess. She was the goddess of wisdom. And also, she was the protector of Athens. That's where the city got its name. If it's not obvious, that's part of the meaning here. That Athena was the patron goddess. You don't want to say saint, that's a Catholic concept. This is before Christianity, obviously. So if you just say she was the most powerful, well, nobody's argued with me, I'm surprised. Actually, Hera, the wife of Zeus, was slightly more powerful, but actually, most times people think of them as equally powerful. So you could say is one of the two most powerful, there we go, of all the ancient Greek goddesses. She was an offspring of Zeus, not born like humans are, but an offspring of Zeus. Zeus was the head god, if you didn't already know that, Zeus, you probably heard his name. And his wife was Hera, Hera. So They didn't procreate like humans, but Athena was born from Zeus's uh, body, we'll just say, full grown out of his forehead, if you want to know, but you don't have to write that much detail. You could just say he was, sorry, I'll say it again. Athena was an offspring of, or born from the body, you want to write it that way, of Zeus, and was one of the two most powerful ancient Greek goddesses. But the most important fact why this temple is here and why we're focused on it is this temple was the one dedicated to her, worshiping her. It was the most important temple in Athens. It had a 50-foot tall statue of her in the back in a separate room where you could go pray to her. 50 feet tall. It was made out of gold and ivory. Can you imagine? Solid gold and ivory. Pretty impressive. Long gone. Nobody seems to know what happened to it. Sometime around the fall of Rome, it disappeared. The Romans continued worshiping her. I think you all know, right? The Greeks and Romans had the same gods, slightly different names. So the Romans continued to use this temple. But when the Greeks built it, this is maybe the most important fact, it became this temple, the Parthenon, became the prototype for all Greek classical temples. It still is, and I'll prove it to you in the next few slides, where you'll see buildings outside of Greece that are copies of this temple. It's still influential, this style of architecture. So it's a classical Greek temple style, and this is the first building to become, a full example of that style, the ancient classical Greek temple style. Well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, totally symmetrical. We'll do the formal elements, of course, in a little while here. But the meaning has quite a number of things about it. Remember, you don't have to recall everything on the exams. I don't know if I said this. I think I have. When we review, I'll remind you. Excuse me, I had something for my throat. Anyway, the point is that this is going to be more than 6 facts. Obviously, on the meaning of some slides is much more than that, but you only have to recall 6 sentences, 6 separate facts if you want an A on or full point credit on each of the 3 short essay questions, slide analysis, I call them, on the midterm and the final. So what are the other facts about the meaning of this? What makes it classical Greek temple style, or a prototype for that style? In other words, after this temple, all the other Greek and later Romans, they copied the Greeks when it comes to architecture, although they invented new things. We'll get to them later, of course. So the Greeks and Romans both kept this style throughout the ancient world until the fall of Rome. So first, it's symmetry, bilateral symmetry. By definition, everybody knows what that is by now. We've covered it a lot. Completely symmetrical. Or is it? No, it's an optical illusion. This is part of the meaning. This temple actually is deliberately uneven spacing, you can say has uneven spacing between the columns so that it looks like it has even spacing. There's no other way to say that. These two guys were not only architects, like most architects, they were mathematical, well, they were geniuses, just say skilled mathematicians. They figured out a new design technique. You don't have to know the name for it, that's getting too detailed. In previous classes, we used to require you to know exactly what this technique was and label it. You don't have to do that. You can just say, these two architects came up with a way of designing the facade. That's the front, right? Of course, I hope you know that word. It should be useful for you on the midterm or the final. So they came up with a way of designing the facade in which the columns are actually not evenly spaced. Look carefully, and I think you can see that if you look really carefully. But when you just stand in front of it and look at it without anybody explaining that, it looks completely balanced and symmetrical, like the spacing, in other words, of all the columns is even. It isn't. It's an optical illusion. I don't even know the details of how it works. You'd have to talk about, human eyesight and the biology of that and the psychology of it. All you have to know is that it works. It works brilliantly. Everyone looking at this temple for the first time, unless they know that fact, would never guess that the columns are not evenly spaced. So it looks completely symmetrical when technically it's slightly asymmetrical if you want to look at the distance. Well, we're talking about the distance between the columns. So it has the appearance of full bilateral symmetry, even though technically it's slightly not, somewhat. The other things are the pediment, and that's the definition here. We have two more definitions, and these are short definitions. I can assure you of that. And that is portico is here we go. That's what we're looking at here on the facade. I'm following the outline of it here. Between the steps and the roof line. So a portico, it's one sentence definition, is a columned front, sorry, I misspoke already. I apologize. I'll start again. Portico, P-O-R-T-I-C-O, of course, is a columned porch. There we go. A columned porch across the front of a Greek or Roman temple, period. I'll say it again. A portico is a columned, with an ED, of course, porch across the front of a Greek or Roman temple. Every other Greek or Roman temple did that from this point on, and even modern ones that are, you'll see what I mean, buildings even in this last century, well, the 20th century, did this same thing. They have porticos. The White House and all classical architecture all over the world, every continent has, except Antarctica, classical buildings, which were inspired by this style. The ancient Greek classical temples first used completely intact, where all these features are in one building. So that's why this is called a prototype. It was the first building to do that, to have all these features. It has the placement of the columns that appear to be evenly spaced, even though they're not. I'll go ahead and tell you the word for it if you want to. It could be an easy extra credit option, or if you wrote a paper about one of these type of buildings, you would need to mention this. And stasis. That word has several meanings, but when it comes to architecture, it's exactly what I just told you. It's the technique of mathematically calculating the distances between the columns so they appear, even though they're not even, to be exactly evenly spaced. E-N-S-T-A-S-I-S, but you don't have to know that word. So we have the portico with its, unevenly placed columns appearing to be even. We have then the other feature is this. It's called a pediment. And our last definition for today, again, it's short. The pediment is a triangular enclosure above the roof line of a Greek or Roman temple. A triangular enclosure above the roof line, that's where the roof would have been. It's missing, of course, it's long gone, the roof. But the pediment's also damaged, obviously. I'll explain how. It was a tragedy what happened to this building. Otherwise, it'd be intact today. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so again, that's the pediment. Again, one more time. Pediment is a triangular enclosure above the roof line of a Greek or Roman temple. So what would have been used? Why would they have a pediment? For sculpture. You notice it's missing most of the sculpture. That's part of the meaning of this, and it's one of the more controversial facts about this. You could say tragic facts. What happened? All of the sculpture was still there when Greece got independent from Turkey. The Turks occupied Greece for hundreds of years, and they didn't damage, well, yes, they did. They damaged the temple by storing dynamite, or gunpowder, not dynamite, gunpowder for their army. The Turkish army that occupied Greece, were stored inside the most sacred building to ancient Greek historians. And one night it exploded. No one knows if it was an accident or what, but it blew the roof and many of the columns down, destroyed them. That's why you see the pediment is missing the top part. But the sculpture was still there for another couple of hundred years until the Brits came along. And this is the last fact I'll say about the meaning. That when the British helped the Greeks kick the Turks out, there's no other way to say it. It took like years of war, of rebellion against the Turkish occupiers. Greece finally got its independence, and the local British general, commander, however you want to write that, who helped the Greeks, stole, there's no other word for it, stole the entire group of sculpture except this one little piece. I don't know why he didn't take those, and took them back to London, where they are still on display at the British Museum. The Greeks are still angry about that 200 years later. They've been asking for those sculptures back for decades, and the British Museum won't return them. So if you have Greek heritage, or you know we would do, that's a sore point with them. Just like calling Ukrainians Russians. No, they're two different countries. We're learning. People didn't already know that. Yeah, people have pride in their heritage. And of course, they have good reason to be. This is such a beautiful, influential building. First, it was disrespected by the occupying Turkish army, storing gunpowder in it, and that caused severe damage to it. Otherwise, it'd be intact. And then on top of that, add insult to injury, if you want to call it that. The second tragic thing that happened was all these pieces of sculpture that were here, including Athena, one of Athena right here with Zeus and, her so-called father and the other gods all around her. All of those pieces, beautiful pieces of larger than life size sculpture of all the major Greek gods, were stolen by a British general who was in Athens at the time they got their independence from Turkey, and taken back to London. So that's pretty much all of the meanings of this. But I'm going to prove to you the point I made before we do the formal elements. Look at this. Anybody guess where this, unless you've been to this city? I've not been. It's in a state that's in the almost dead center of the United States. It's nowhere near Greece. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. This is some government building built around 1900. I think it was for a local version, not a World's Fair, but a regional fair, someone like us. See, this is what you would have seen when it was new. There's Athena. There she is. She was also a warrior. That's why she was chosen as the goddess to symbolize Athens, and that they named the city after her and built that temple, because she was a warrior as well as a goddess. Some of the gods and goddesses weren't militaristic, but she was always shown with an armor, with a helmet and a spear or a sword and a shield in her hands. These are the pieces of sculpture that were stolen, the original pieces, of course, which were maybe not white marble originally. They could have been painted like this. We think this is the colors of the original colors of the Parthenon. This building has been used, I don't know if it's city, county, or state government, some part of the government in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee. It's fascinating. And then I think there's another one in another city somewhere else in the South. I think that's in Georgia. So you see the influences of this technique or style, rather, of ancient classical Greek temples, still influences thousands of years later. Okay, so that's, I think, plenty on the meaning here. So let's do a formal analysis. Oh, you could add this, you don't have to, you have enough, but somebody may wonder, what's all this rubble doing? And it might seem like, oh, it must have been part of the building blown up in, knocked down over the, entire area by the explosion. That was more than 300 years ago, when the Turks stored the gunpowder there, and it ignited one night. I think it was accidental. Nobody knows. No, that's not what this rubble's from. The rubble in front of it is from a previous temple that the Persians destroyed. The Persians invaded Greece, attacked Greece 3 times, and once they succeeded in getting all the way to Athens. And that's when the previous temple, also dedicated to Athena, but not in this style, similar, but not in this perfect example of a Greek classical temple, was destroyed by the invading Persian army. So these pieces of rubble are from that previous invasion. So they're several decades older, if not centuries older, than the temple, what's left of it. They're restoring it, by the way, slowly. The Greek government. I don't know if they'll ever finish restoring it, but they've been working on it slowly for a few decades. Okay, formal analysis. Even though the columns are unevenly spaced, the amount of space between each of the 1, 2, 3, right? You see 3 sections with space, 1, 2, 3, and then this one in the middle. It is balanced, even though technically speaking, there's differences in the width of the area between the columns. So all you have to write is this way. It is balanced left to right. And I would argue top to bottom, because the pediment and the base, which includes the stairs, goes all the way down to here, are roughly equal areas when the pediment was intact and the stairs weren't. cluttered with rubble. Anybody been to Greece here? Out of all my classes, only a handful of people seem to get to Athens. But if you do, you can't get close to the temple anymore. I have my own slides of this, and maybe if time permits next week, I'll show you some of the close-ups when you could walk all the way up to the columns. You weren't supposed to touch them, of course. You can't do that now. There's a wire rope around it. So too many, I guess, tourists touching it. So you have to stay several feet away from it now. Anyway, so this again is balanced left to right, and I would certainly say top to bottom. The pediment and the base are about equal. Color is a warm yellow color of stone. It's a beautiful color. The texture is the real smooth texture of marble. And there was simulated texture. There still is a little bit left on, see, there's only a handful of, they're mostly animals now left on this. This is called the frieze. I used to put that word on the list of terms, but I'm giving you plenty already, so you don't have to know that term. The section here of decorative stonework below the pediment, it's called the frieze, but you don't have to write it. You could just say there's some a very minimal simulated texture. Would have been a lot before when all those pieces in the pediment were still there before they were stolen. But now there's only a little minor bits, or as you can say, minimal amounts of simulated texture on the few animal figures and the two humans here. Otherwise, everything is the real smooth texture of marble. All the line is, well, there's both kinds of line. Carved line, right, on the above and below the pediment, what there is left of this carved line. And then, of course, visual line. All buildings have visual line right there on the edges, which is created by the shadows, the natural modeling from the sunlight. The largest mass, it's the columns, if you break it down. Now, if you think of the pediment as a single mass, then that probably would have been the largest mass. That and then the base were about equal. So if you want to look at it that way, then I guess those are the two largest masses, and then it would be the columns, and then it would be the well, there is only one word for this section here, right below the pediment and above the columns. That's a frieze. That'd be the third largest mass if you decide to write about it as equally, roughly, first and largest masses being the pediment and then the base. They're almost the same area. Space, it's a real space. It's about a 55-foot high, would have originally been a 50-foot high ceiling with several rooms, including the one in the back where the 50-foot tall statue of Athena used to be. The columns are about 50 feet tall. And the top of the building is about 70 feet. So the peak of the pediment, when it was originally intact, where the roof line was, top of it would have been about 70 feet. The columns are 50 feet and the ceiling would have been about 55. So that's the real space. Let's see, rhythm, obviously the columns, the stairs, the decorative panels along. You could just say below the pediment if you don't want to remember the word frieze. Create repeated shapes, of course. And it is mostly stable, except that the columns individually are round, but they're straight, upright. And of course, each individual column is stable, but the shape of the outer edges is dynamic, and the pediment would have been both. Of course, the bottom of the pediment would be stable. The triangular top part would have been dynamic. Okay, I think I covered everything, right? Color is warm, I covered that. Okay, now we already did those. This is not a must, so I just wanted you to see. This actually is extremely relevant to what's happening in the world now. You don't have to write this. But the Ukrainians have a proud history that goes way back before there was anything called Russia. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. These were Amazon warriors that the Greeks admired, and the Amazons were the forerunners of Ukrainians. This surprises a lot of people. Ukraine has a history going back 3,000 years, when what's now Russia was people foraging in the forests with no towns or cities, maybe small villages. The Ukrainians were called the Scythians. You don't have to know this, but just for those who are interested, Scythins. Museums all over the world have gold, beautiful gold jewelry and armor and weapons from that culture. And that's where the Amazons came from. The word Amazon, the whole concept, and we're not talking about the website or the river. We're talking about the original use of the word Amazon, were female warriors who lived in the area now called Ukraine and had their own kingdom. They were, jointly ruled by male and female rulers, but their warriors, their top warriors were females, and they were very fierce, and the Greeks fought them. Because if you look at a map, Greece back then was bigger than it is now, would have gone all the way up to the edge of what's now Ukraine, the Balkans, right? That area where Greece and the other countries near it are, was mostly under Greek rule, and to the upper, right around the shores of the Black Sea, was what we now call Ukraine, and was, of course, part of the Russian Empire for centuries before that. So they had their own kingdom, their own history, their own culture for thousands of years before Russia was even started as a country. And this is the honor paid to them by their enemies, the Greeks. They almost always lost their battles when they fought these female warriors from the Scythian, they call it culture war, now Ukrainian. And here they're 8 feet tall. They're used as columns to support the porch of one of their temples. It's next door to the Parthenon. I didn't tell you what hill it is, but let's do that with the next must know. And here it is. Okay, this is the Temple of Athena Nike. We're going to end maybe 5 minutes early today. I'm sure no one will object to that. Temple of Athena Nike. Yes, the tennis shoe is named after this minor Greek goddess. Athena, I think you know, is Athena, of course, same goddess, but Nike was her messenger, her sidekick, her assistant, however you want to write that. Capital Nike. So again, Temple of Athena Nike. This was designed by one of the same architects, not both together, but just one of the two who designed the Parthenon. Callicrates, again, that's Kallikrates, Callicrates, 425 BC. This is on a hill called the Acropolis. That's an important part of the meaning, which has the 5 once held. You should say once held the 5 most important temples in Athens. Already mentioned the Parthenon, but I didn't say that the location was. So now you should add that to the meaning of this slide. That this is one of 5 temples on a hill above what was then, of course, ancient Athens, the 5 most important temples in Athens, one of which we already know was the Parthenon. This was the smallest temple, and that's not a very good slide, so I'm actually getting a more recent, better lit one. And what's left of it is pretty well intact for the walls and the portico, but the pediment's missing, that should be obvious, and the roof. I have no idea why. It probably was during the time of the Turks. The Turks, when they were an empire, not saying now, but modern Turkey, it's a different situation. But in the Middle Ages, it would be in Renaissance, the Turks had an empire that was one of the biggest in the world for hundreds of years, but they did not respect the cultures they occupied. I just gave you an example of how they treated the Parthenon. They may or may not have had similar kinds of disrespect for this temple. In any case, it wasn't maintained, to say it that way. It wasn't maintained over the centuries, so it's lost its pediment and its roof. But it still has a portico, and it has decorative sculpture along the frieze. It's still pretty much all there. But of course, the pediment would have had a statue of, now we know what was inside because that piece is still intact. That's the original sculpture of Athena Nike. Now, if you didn't write it before now, you should as part of the meaning. Who was she? Athena Nike was the sidekick, you could say, or assistant, but the right word is messenger of Athena. She accompanied Athena everywhere. Whenever Athena was, not just relaxing or resting, when she was out in the world doing anything, she would have had Athena Nike with her. And Athena Nike was supposedly normal human size, which for a woman back then was about 5 feet. So this was a 5 foot tall piece of sculpture. Obviously someone damaged it, who knows when or who, carving the head or chopping the head off, but the body's intact. It shows Athena Nike getting ready to go deliver a message at the instructions of Athena. Athena would tell her, go down to earth and deliver a message to these groups of humans, whatever it was, the message. She was Athena's messenger. And here she is shown adjusting her sandal, which means what, she's getting ready to fly. She could fly, she had wings. By the way, the wings were also See that they were taken away too. Both the head and the wings were chopped off somehow by some vandal. But originally it was on the back wall, this sculpture. Now that's what's been saved. It's been removed from the temple and put in a museum in Athens. It's a beautiful piece of sculpture. It was on the wall back here. If you want to see one more view, it was right there. And that's why they removed it, as you can guess, is A, to protect it, and B, because the pollution in Athens. You can add this part of it. It's just a fact. Athens is one of the most polluted cities in the world. It's gotten a little better the last time I checked, a little better than when I was there, but it's the smog there is horrible because it's so crowded and the streets are so narrow and traffic, there's so many cars and buses. It's terribly badly polluted. So to protect the sculpture of some of the temples that had survived on the Acropolis. Now, I didn't spell that, so I'll spell it for you. Acropolis is capital Acropolis. Acropolis was the hill above the main town of Athens. Now it's all part of the city, within the city limits of Athens, on which the 5 most sacred or important ancient Greek temples were located, one of which is this one, the smallest of all of them. Okay, so let's do a formal analysis. It's pretty much the whole meaning, and then we're still going to be at the end a little early with our last slide here, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. All right, so if it's on the exam, it's symmetrical. Now here they didn't need to use that technique because it's not that big a temple. So how big is it? These columns are about 12 feet high. So the ceiling would have been around 12 feet. I can't exactly guess. I can guesstimate that you're looking at about probably 16 feet, 15 or more feet, 15 or a little more than 15 feet for the peak of the pediment when it was there. So that's the real space. It's completely symmetrical, totally balanced. In this case, it really is. There's no difference in the distance between these columns. The rhythm is obvious. The columns create rhythm. The stairs, the panels, the sculptural. I think they're just minor gods and things, but you don't know what they are. That's done with carved line, and the columns have carved line. You can see that, right, on each column. There's no painted line visible here. There might have been originally up here, but we don't know that. It is almost entirely stable. The pediment would have been dynamic, but it's gone. So it's all right angles, except for the shape of each column, of course, so that's dynamic. The largest mass, well, I would say it's close, but probably the base, the stairs and the base, if it's all one section. And then each wall, and then third largest would be the columns. The modeling is the shadows from the sun, of course, and the color is a cool light gray color. And the texture is the real smooth texture of marble, right? And some simulated texture on the sculpture above the columns. Okay, we're going to end with, I skip over because I'm going to cut one of these. Yeah, Young Warrior from Riace, Italy, this one. Just go ahead and cross it off because I was going to do that during the review, but since we want to end at least not late, if not slightly early, we don't want to go over. So the Young Warrior, it's another sculpture that's in obviously bronze and not marble in contrapposto, but we already defined that for you. Okay, everybody see that? It's the 4th one down from this week's list. Young Warrior, Riace, Italy. Just cross it off, even though it's actually very interesting. I want to give you guys a break. And let's get to our last must know. By the way, this is a mosaic. You don't have to write this up. It's not on syllabus. Of Alexander the Great conquering Persia. He's the first Western conqueror / invader, or king, whatever, ruler, to able to defeat the Persian Empire in Persia. I mean, to overthrow it. And then he introduced some limited democracy, such as it was, during the time that his army occupied what's now Iran. Of course, Persia and Iran are synonymous, the 2 words. This shows the moment in which he defeated the king of Persia. There is that king, and there's Alexander the Great. Okay, so last must know. Nike, just like I already spelled for you, it's the same spelling as the last slide, but the parentheses, this is different. The meaning of this is different than the temple. Nike, a winged victory. I put that in parentheses, but if you want to just put semicolon, Nike, comma, or semicolon, winged victory, just like it sounds. Samothrace, it's the location. We don't know for sure who carved it. Samothrace, a Greek island. Samothrace, 190 BC. This is Hellenistic. Hellenistic is the period after, that's just like the word Helen, you know, the first name with two L's. Hellenistic is the last period of ancient Greek art, comes after the classical era, and it's named after him, Alexander the Great. The whole point is Alexander the Great brought Greek art to three continents. He's the only person in the history of the human race that conquered three continents in less than 10 years. No one else has ever done that. What was then most of the populated, you know, urban areas of Europe were already under a lot of it under Greek rule. He expanded that area. Then he conquered a whole chunk of Asia, all the way into India. Even a part of India became part of his empire, all the way into North Africa and along the Red Sea. Pretty big empire and pretty important in the history of the world. So just summarize it this way. Say this is a period called Hellenistic art, in which Alexander the Great's empire created the classical poses. She's in contrapposto, even though she's got, you know, robes and you can't see the bottom of her legs. That's not new. We know, right? But it has Hellenistic style Greek, late, we can call it late classical, but the right word is Hellenistic Greek sculpture, which is in the last 200 years of the ancient Greek empire, from beginning with the empire founded by Alexander the Great. Just keep it simple. That's all I have to say about him. It starts with him. It shows two things that mark it as Hellenistic. Okay, and one is very detailed, decorative carving. Look at the wings. Her wings are almost like a real bird's wings, and her robes here. So a lot of decorative, or you could say extreme decorative detailing. And the other is a strong emotional quality. You can't see that here because her face is missing, but the pose tells us this. What is she doing? She's rewarding some humans who won a naval battle. That's literally what the meaning of this is. It is a symbol of naval victory. That's why the subtitle is Winged Victory. That was her job, to go down to earth and reward people. One of the many jobs that Athena gave Nike was reward the people on that boat or in that harbor or whatever, usually at sea, a sea battle. When they won a battle and had prayed to Athena, they were rewarded after their victory by Athena, who would send Nike, her messenger, down to their boat, their ship, their warship, which is what this is. It's supposed to be the prow of a warship. And she's landing on the prow of that boat, and she's telling them they'll all be given whatever gold or, you know, jewels or land or, you know, happy marriages, whatever it was that Athena thought they deserved as a reward for their victory. So this became the symbol for navies all over the world. I think it's over a dozen countries adopted this for an image, not the statue itself, of course. It's in Paris at the Louvre. It's on the main staircase of the Louvre Museum in Paris. How did it get there? Probably stolen by the French under Napoleon. But anyway, just say that it currently is on display at the Louvre in Paris. But originally, when it was first found, yes, the head was missing. The people could know what her head looked like. There's some sculptures left of her. It was used as an image for many of the world's navies to symbolize them having victories over their enemies. Now, I believe the early U.S. Navy did, but I'm not sure of that. Just say many navies around the world adopted a version of this, an image of this statue to symbolize their navies. That's plenty on the meaning. So the emotion was victory, you know, pride. And you know, you can say, if you want to say, you know, celebration of a victory at sea specifically. All right. So let's do a formal analysis, and then I'll stick around with any questions you may have. It's a single mass. Well, not really, because the prow of the boat is a separate mass. If that's not original, I can't tell. I don't know. It probably was something, if that's a replacement by the museum. So just say if there was originally a base, then obviously it's just two masses. Her, the largest, and then the base or prow of the boat. It's totally dynamic. I don't see anything stable about it. She's leaning forward like she just landed, coming down from the sky, of course, with her wings stretched out. Her legs are in contrapposto, actually, but of course they're not straight up and down. So everything's dynamic. Carved line is used everywhere to create very realistic cement texture. That's the whole point of Hellenistic sculpture. More detail, and that's of course on the texture of the robes, but especially on her wings. I mean, they're so lifelike. If you've ever seen the bird's wings up close, I got to go to a field trip with my daughter once when she was in grade school, and we got to touch the bird's wings at the Lawrence Hall of Science at UC Berkeley. It's a very distinct texture if you've never seen it. Accurate and realistic, but very detailed. And that's all carved line. Of course, the modeling is, of course, the museum lighting. And then it's balanced. It would have been originally, of course, with the head here, the two wings, roughly equal to the area covered by the legs, depending on where you draw the line across the midsection. It's roughly balanced top to bottom, and definitely left to right, symmetrical. And let's see, color would have been a warm yellow stone. And this slide makes it look almost kind of reddish orange, but it's really a yellow stone. And of course, the texture is similar, I already said, on the wings and the robes, but there's some of the real texture of marble, not much of it, but a little bit around the waist. And then this is the real rough texture of stone on the base. I think I've covered everything, right? Okay, and the rhythm is obvious, the legs, the wings, the feathers. All right, any questions from anybody about anything we've covered? Let's go ahead and stop the share part now. About your papers, remember if you joined us, I think I already said this to everyone who joined a couple minutes late, that are due by midnight if you don't want points off, so you have time to work on them. And I'm not going to hold up that paper again. I did that already at the start of this lecture, which has the format. But I sent everyone an email too, right? With that specifically, you do need to say that it's to PDF, of course, only. Please submit it in PDF format, which should be labeled, Art 2.1, short paper number 1, and then underline first name, comma, last name, and send it to AOL if you want it to be graded on time with all the others. If you send it to the campus website, you still get credit. Of course, and it won't be late if you do it before midnight, but it'll be faster to get your grade back if you send it to markw@aol.com. Of course. Anybody have any questions about anything we've covered now, or your assignments, the papers, or extra credit? Anybody? Now's the time to ask. Managed to finish 2 minutes. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I just had real quick. I didn't send you my paper. I know I'm clear. It's clear that it won't be late, but I guess I have that noted that if I wanted to let you look at it in advance, I will send it.
That's a good idea, because taking the extra time might result in a better grade, because you'll have more time. And I will give you feedback. Thank you for saying that. Everybody hear that? It's important. If you expect me to give you feedback when you submit your first version of the paper, you need to ask me that. Otherwise, I'll just think you turned it in early or late and don't need or want feedback. So you did, Victoria. If you put it in your email, you'll get feedback from me by, well, it depends on what day you send it. Try to get it in before, if you want feedback. Don't wait until next Tuesday, because I need more than 24 hours. So give me, by the weekend would be fine. If you can do it sooner, you'll get my response sooner. As long as you get it turned in, the final version, by Tuesday, it's only 5 points off. You can make that up with extra credit. So I wouldn't worry about that. It sounds like it makes sense for you to take the extra time, and I'll give you the feedback. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Of course. Anybody else? And have any other questions about? I think you all know my late policy. I hope to get most of your papers so I can get started sending them to a reader and grading the ones that I'm going to grade, because I've got 2 classes with papers due today. Okay, so and the other one's bigger than this class. So, it's going to give me up to 2 weeks to get all of the grades back to everybody who turned them in on time. Or if they were only a couple days late, you'll probably get yours back with the others as well. But don't forget to label them correctly. I already covered that. All right, any other questions from anybody about, papers, due dates, or extra credit, or anything relating to what we just covered, the ancient Greek slides? At least one of those that you saw today will be on, probably a good chance 2 of them on the midterm. And we are going to review for the midterm. Remember, when the midterm is, just as a heads up, for this class, it's March 16th. So you've got some time, and we're going to review the week before that about how the test looks and how it's going to be graded, how to study for it, what is and isn't going to be on, or potentially. I won't give you the exact slides that could be on the test. That would be giving it all away, but it's an open book, open note test, so it shouldn't be too stressful. And you'll have until midnight the day of the test, but it is a real-time test. I'm not recording it, so you want to attend that lecture, and then you could take more time if you need to. But well, we cap all of this the week before the exam, and we'll cut this slide list down by 40% before the test, on the last class before the midterm. Okay, one more time. Any questions from anybody?
I had a quick random question.
Uh-huh.
I was just wondering, would you say that the Greek culture had a longer lasting impact than the Egyptian culture?
That's an interesting question, and it depends on your perspective or what you're thinking of, but I would say it's about equal, except for one thing in terms of, well, now if we're see, depends on also what part of the world we're talking about. In the modern, quote, Western world, okay, if we're talking about, Western Europe, most of the Middle East is considered in that category. And of course, the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, you'd have to say probably because of the concepts, whether they're followed faithfully or not, of democracy, philosophy, the scientific method, right? Socratic method is called, still used, and then the architectural influence. You could make that case. You could definitely make that case. But of course, there's a lot of influence from ancient Egypt. They invented frescoes. They invented columns, temples.
So you would say Egypt's like a close second?
You could say that. I'm not going to take that position one way or the other because it'd be an interesting topic to debate. And it's the kind of topic I'll bet a lot of college and even high school debate teams have discussed, not just that, but others. Those two were probably, well, the Romans, you can't ignore them either, although they were copying the Greeks when it came to most of their art. But they did create, we'll talk about that, of course, soon. They created, so all three of them, I'd say they're very close, very, very close in terms of their continuing influence, again, on the, quote, modern Western world. But when you talk about democracy, India is the largest democracy in the world. And it is a democracy, imperfect, all democracies are imperfect, right? No, there's no such thing as a perfect society, however you analyze them or how you compare them to each other. But the fact is that's an influence from ancient Greece. And there, look at India. It's halfway around the world almost from Greece. Well, thousands of miles.
Right.
So you could make the case. I wouldn't dispute that. But on the other hand, you could also argue that it's more like an equal balance between the Greeks, the Romans, and the Egyptians. All three of them left major impacts in the world we still have today. That's why I think art history is interesting. It's the best way to study history. It's not just a bunch of facts and numbers and dates. I know some of it is that, but it's ideas, concepts, discussions of the differences and comparisons. Hopefully that's what you guys are all doing with your papers and will on the essay part of the exam. And for extra credit. Don't forget you have that option, I hope you do, of taking any type of topic relating to art. I said the life of an artist, but I think I expanded that extra credit option. You can actually do watch documentaries and write 2 pages of what you learned about, let's say, that very subject, what you just asked. Let's see, what's Colin, right? I guess he's over here. Which is that, you could make that, in some documentaries, the people who made documentary clearly have that focus. You could say bias if you want, or perspective. Oh, this culture is superior to all the other ancient ones, or even later ones. And is that right or wrong? Well, you could decide for yourself. But if you want to write about a documentary about ancient Greek art and architecture, or Roman or Egyptian art, I would give you the same 10 points for extra credit if you write 2 pages about what you learned, as long as it's at least 1 full hour in length. So there's one more extra credit option I've already mentioned, but I modified it a little broad in that category. Okay, one more time. Any other questions anybody has? These are all good points you guys are raising. So hopefully I'll see all of the rest of the papers that are going to be turned in on time before midnight tonight. Okay, all right. See you guys on Monday night. Take care. Bye. See you. Have a good week.
See ya. Have a good week.
Oh, quick one.
Oh, okay. Yes,
You
Carl.
still here? Sorry, I didn't want to hold everyone up still. But when you were talking about the Temple of Athena Nike,
Mhm.
you were talking about the pollution in Athens, and I kind of missed, was there a link that you were talking about that particular
Well, yeah, the
sculpture?
Greek, yeah, I didn't make it that explicit. The government of either the city of Athens or the Greek federal government decided to remove that piece of sculpture on the back wall into a museum because it was being slowly deteriorated from the
Right,
pollution. Yeah,
from the smog.
yeah, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, right, definitely. My Greek friends, some of whom work at museums in Athens, when I was there, I spent like weeks in Athens. It was fascinating. Well, all over Greek, modern Greece, and looking at ancient sites, and went to all the main museums. A couple of them told me that oh no, we had to save it from the deterioration of the effects of pollution. All right, see you
All
guys.
right, thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too.